Have you ever wondered what horrors lie buried beneath the frozen earth of a battlefield, guarded not by soldiers or barbed wire, but by a single, loyal animal that refuses to leave its post, even as death surrounds it? Before we descend into this chilling account, I need you to do something for me. First, comment below and tell me where you're watching from, because this story connects to places all over the world in ways you cannot yet imagine. Second, hit that subscribe button. This channel survives only because of viewers like you who help us uncover these buried secrets that powerful forces would rather keep hidden forever. Your subscription is not just support, it is an act of defiance against those who would erase these truths from history. February 1943, the Eastern Front. Somewhere in the contested territories between Stalingrad and Kursk, a Soviet engineering battalion received orders that seemed routine at first. Captain Dmitry Volkov and his unit of 23 men were tasked with surveying a sector recently reclaimed from German forces. Their mission was simple: document the terrain, identify usable structures, clear unexploded ordnance, and prepare detailed maps for the advancing Red Army divisions that would follow. The winter had been particularly brutal that year. Temperatures hovered around -30 degrees Celsius. Snow covered everything in sheets of white that made navigation treacherous and landmarks nearly impossible to identify. The battalion arrived at the coordinates on the morning of February 17th. What they found was a landscape of devastation. Shell craters pockmarked the earth like the surface of some alien moon. Destroyed vehicles, both Soviet and German, lay scattered across the fields, their metal carcasses already half buried in snow. Trees stood as blackened skeletal remains, stripped of bark and branches by artillery fire. The silence was profound. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of boots on frozen ground and the occasional creak of metal contracting in the cold. Sergeant Alexei Morozov, the unit's demolitions expert, noticed it first. He had been walking the perimeter, marking shell craters that might contain live munitions, when he stopped suddenly. His hand went up, signaling the others to halt. There, approximately 200 meters to the northeast, sitting at the edge of a particularly large crater, was a dog. At first, they thought it might be dead, frozen in place like so many other casualties of war. But as they watched, the animal moved. It was a large dog, possibly a German shepherd or similar breed, though its fur was so matted with dirt, blood, and ice that identification was difficult. The dog sat upright, perfectly still except for its head, which moved slowly from side to side as if scanning the horizon. Even from that distance, Morozov could see that the animal was emaciated, its ribs visible through its filthy coat. What struck him as profoundly wrong, however, was the dog's behavior. It was not scavenging. It was not seeking shelter. It simply sat there at the crater's edge, unmoving, unresponsive to the presence of the soldiers. This was unusual. In Morozov's 2 years on the front, he had seen countless dogs, both military and civilian, wandering the battlefields. They were always desperate, always searching for food or warmth, or their deceased handlers. They never simply sat and watched like sentries. Captain Volkov approached with 3 of his men, moving cautiously. Dogs on battlefields were unpredictable, sometimes rabid, sometimes rigged with explosives by retreating forces. As they drew closer, the animal did not react. It continued its slow, methodical surveillance of the surrounding area, its eyes never settling on the approaching soldiers. When they were within 50 meters, Volkov called out, attempting to coax the animal or at least provoke some response. Nothing. The dog remained fixed in position, as if carved from the same frozen earth it sat upon. Lieutenant Boris Petrov, the battalion's medical officer, raised his binoculars and studied the animal more carefully. What he saw troubled him deeply. The dog was not merely thin, it was dying. Its breathing was labored, visible in small clouds of condensation that puffed irregularly from its muzzle. Open wounds covered its flanks and legs, some fresh, some infected and weeping. One ear appeared to be partially torn away. Yet, despite its obvious suffering, the animal maintained its position with an intensity that bordered on the supernatural. More disturbing was what Petrov noticed about the dog's eyes. They moved constantly, tracking something the soldiers could not see, focusing on points in the air and on the ground around the crater with what appeared to be genuine attention, as if the animal were watching entities invisible to human perception. Private Yuri Smirnov, the youngest member of the unit at just 19 years old, volunteered to approach. He had grown up on a farm outside Minsk and had always possessed an unusual rapport with animals. Volkov hesitated, then agreed, but ordered Smirnov to proceed with extreme caution. The private moved forward slowly, speaking in low, soothing tones. The dog did not acknowledge him, not even a flick of an ear or turn of the head. Smirnov continued until he was less than 10 meters away. Only then did the animal react. The dog's head snapped toward him with mechanical precision. Its lips pulled back, revealing teeth stained with blood, though it made no sound. No growl, no bark, nothing. Just that silent, sustained display of aggression. But it was the dog's eyes that stopped Smirnov cold. They were wrong, unfocused, as if the animal were looking through him rather than at him. Smirnov, who had handled aggressive farm dogs and even wolves in his youth, felt a primal fear that sent him stumbling backward. He would later tell the others that those eyes held something he could not explain. A kind of purposeful emptiness, as if the dog were no longer truly present in its own body, but was being operated by something else, something that understood just enough about canine behavior to maintain the basic functions, but could not quite replicate the spark of genuine animal consciousness. Volkov ordered a withdrawal to reassess. The men retreated to a safe distance and established a temporary camp among the ruins of what had once been a farmhouse. As night fell, they could still see the dog in the distance, silhouetted against the snow, maintaining its vigil. Volkov consulted with his senior officers. The prevailing theory was that the animal had been a German military dog, perhaps separated from its handler during the retreat, and had become territorially fixated on the crater, possibly because its handler's body lay within. Such psychological fixations were documented, though rare, but Sergeant Morozov disagreed. He pointed out several inconsistencies. First, military dogs were trained to obey commands and respond to human approach, even from enemy soldiers. This animal showed no recognition of human presence beyond that single moment of threat display. Second, the crater itself was problematic. Most shell craters in the area were relatively shallow, created by mortars or light artillery. This one was different. Through binoculars in the fading light, they could see it was abnormally deep and wide, more consistent with a bombing raid or heavy siege weapon, yet there were no corresponding craters nearby, no pattern suggesting an aerial assault. Third, and most troubling, was something Morozov had noticed during their initial approach. The snow around the crater's rim was disturbed in strange patterns, as if something had been dragging itself in circles around the perimeter. But the tracks did not belong to the dog. They were larger, deeper, and irregularly spaced, starting and stopping without logical progression. That night, 3 men took shifts watching the crater from their position in the ruined farmhouse. Each reported the same phenomenon. The dog never moved from its position, never lay down, never appeared to sleep. At irregular intervals, its head would snap toward the crater's interior, ears forward, body tensing as if responding to sounds or movements they could not detect. These episodes would last anywhere from 30 seconds to several minutes, after which the dog would resume its slow scanning of the perimeter. Private Ivan Kuznetsov, who took the midnight to 3 a.m. watch, reported something additional. Twice during his shift, He observed what he initially thought were lights within the crater. Not flames or lanterns, but a pale luminescence that seemed to pulse gently, like bioluminescent algae he had once seen in the Black Sea before the war. The light would appear, grow slightly brighter, then fade completely over the course of perhaps 20 seconds. He debated waking the captain, but the phenomenon seemed so uncertain, so possibly imagined, that he ultimately decided to note it in his log and wait for morning. Morning brought complications. A courier arrived with new orders. The battalion was to complete their survey within 48 hours and move to support operations near Kharkov. This gave them precious little time to resolve the mystery of the crater and its guardian. Captain Volkov convened his officers and decided on a direct approach. They would incapacitate the dog if necessary and investigate the crater. If it contained German intelligence, ordnance, or anything of strategic value, it would be extracted. If it was simply a large shell crater, they would document it and move on. 7 men, including Volkov, Morozov, Petrov, and Smirnov, approached the crater at 0900 hours. The dog watched their advance, but did not move. As they closed to within 30 meters, Petrov raised his rifle, prepared to shoot if the animal charged. 20 meters. 15. The dog's body began to tremble, not with fear or aggression, but with what appeared to be extreme exertion, as if maintaining its position required every remaining ounce of strength. 10 meters. Smirnov, again at the front, tried once more to communicate with the animal. He spoke in Russian, then attempted a few German commands he had learned from captured enemy manuals. The dog's eyes locked onto him, but there was no comprehension there, no response to language, just that hollow, mechanical focus. At 5 meters, the dog finally moved, but it did not attack. Instead, it slowly, painfully, lowered itself onto its belly, 4 legs extending forward, head dropping until its muzzle nearly touched the frozen ground. Its eyes remained open, fixed on the approaching soldiers, but its body had assumed a position of complete submission or, perhaps more accurately, complete exhaustion. It could guard no longer. Volkov ordered 2 men to secure the animal while the others investigated the crater. Smirnov and Private Anatoly Sokolov approached the dog carefully, blankets ready to wrap and restrain it. But as they reached down, they realized restraint would be unnecessary. The dog was dying. Its breathing had become ragged and irregular. Blood, dark and viscous, began to seep from its mouth and nose. Its eyes, still open, began to lose focus. In its final moments, the animal did something that haunted Smirnov for the rest of his life. It looked directly at him, and for just an instant there was recognition, not of Smirnov specifically, but of humanity, of help that had come too late. Then, with what must have been its last reserve of energy, the dog turned its head toward the crater, as if directing their attention, before going completely still. Smirnov knelt beside the dead animal, confused by the depth of emotion he felt for a creature he had known for less than 24 hours. He placed a hand on its filthy fur and whispered a prayer his mother had taught him as a child. Then he stood and turned toward the crater, where Volkov and the others had stopped at its edge, their faces drained of color. The crater was approximately 15 meters in diameter and far deeper than any shell crater had a right to be. But depth was not what had frozen the men in place. It was what lined the crater's interior. At first glance in the morning light, it appeared to be ice, which would not have been unusual given the temperature, but as Morozov descended carefully on a rope, his boots making contact with the surface, he realized it was not ice. It was glass, or something very much like glass. The entire interior of the crater, from rim to bottom, was coated in a smooth, fused, translucent material that caught and refracted light in unsettling ways. As he descended deeper, Morozov's voice echoed up to the others. The glass-like substance was not uniform. It contained inclusions, objects trapped within its matrix, like insects in amber. At first, these appeared to be debris, fragments of metal and wood consistent with battlefield wreckage. But as he reached the midpoint of his descent, approximately 7 meters down, the nature of the inclusions changed. They were bodies, or what remained of bodies. Soldiers, both German and Soviet, based on the fragments of uniforms visible, were embedded in the glassy surface at various angles and depths. Some appeared to have been running, frozen mid-stride. Others were reaching upward, mouths open in silent screams. The preservation was remarkable and horrifying. Faces were clearly visible, expressions of terror captured with photographic precision. Morozov counted at least 30 individual figures embedded in the visible portions of the crater wall. He shouted up to Volkov, describing what he saw, his voice shaking despite his years of military discipline. Volkov ordered him to continue to the crater floor and assess what lay at the bottom. Morozov complied, though every instinct screamed at him to climb back up and never return. The crater bottom was approximately 12 meters below ground level, far deeper than any conventional explosive should have created, without leaving massive debris scattered across a wide area. The floor was smooth, almost perfectly circular, and covered in the same glassy substance. But here, the inclusions were denser. Morozov found himself standing on what was essentially a transparent surface, beneath which dozens of bodies lay pressed together like specimens in some nightmarish display. At the center of the crater floor was something that defied immediate understanding. It appeared at first to be a machine or perhaps a vehicle, but its form was wrong. Angular surfaces met at impossible angles. Components that might have been metal or ceramic were fused together without visible seams or joints. The entire structure, roughly 3 meters across and perhaps 1 meter tall, was partially embedded in the glassy floor, as if it had been present when whatever created the crater had occurred and had somehow survived while everything around it was vaporized and fused. Morozov approached carefully, his breath coming in rapid clouds. The object was inscribed with markings, but they matched no language or symbol system he recognized. Not Russian, not German, not any alphabet he had encountered in his education or military service. The symbols seemed to shift slightly when he was not looking directly at them, though he attributed this to the light playing through the translucent material surrounding the object. As he circled the structure, his boot struck something that was not glassy, not embedded. It was a journal, leather-bound, lying on the surface as if recently placed there. Morozov picked it up with trembling hands, noting that its pages were not frozen, not even particularly cold despite the sub-zero temperatures. He opened it carefully. The entries were in German, written in a neat, methodical hand. The first page was dated December 12, 1942, approximately 2 months before the Soviet engineers arrived. Morozov's German was limited, but he could make out certain phrases, references to das Objekt, the object, repeated mentions of Beobachtungen, observations, and one phrase that appeared again and again, underlined multiple times. Sie wachen auf, they are waking up. Morozov shouted up to Volkov, describing the journal. The captain ordered him to bring it immediately and return to the surface. As Morozov secured the journal in his coat and began his ascent, he glanced once more at the object at the crater's center. For just a moment, he could have sworn he saw that same pale luminescence Private Kuznetsov had reported, pulsing gently beneath the glassy surface like the slow breath of something vast and patient. He climbed faster, suddenly desperate to be out of that hole in the earth, away from the frozen faces and the impossible angles and the symbols that seemed to writhe at the edges of his vision. When he finally pulled himself over the crater's rim, gasping and shaking, he found the other soldiers backing away from the edge, their weapons raised toward something he could not immediately identify. Then he saw it. The dog's body was no longer where they had left it. It had been dragged approximately 3 meters closer to the crater, leaving a trail of disturbed snow and dark blood. But that was not what held the soldiers' attention. Around the crater's perimeter, spaced at roughly equal intervals, were other shapes, at least 9 of them, possibly more obscured by terrain. They were dogs, or had been. Each one appeared to have died in the same position as their fallen comrade, sitting upright, facing the crater, frozen in various stages of decay. Some were little more than skeletal remains, held together by scraps of fur and frozen tissue. Others appeared fresher, dead perhaps days or weeks rather than months, but all shared that same sentinel posture, that same directed attention toward the crater's depths. It was as if they had been taking shifts, as if each animal had maintained the vigil until death, only to be replaced by another, and another, in a cycle that might have been continuing for far longer than any of them wanted to contemplate. Lieutenant Petrov, moving on autopilot, approached the nearest remains. It wore a collar, German military issue, the identification tag still attached. He read the inscription aloud. Thor, Dienstbereich Ost, 1941. A German military dog assigned to Eastern operations, dating back to the first year of the war in the East. This animal had been dead for over a year, yet something had kept it, and others, bound to this place. Captain Volkov made a decision. They would take the journal, photograph the crater and its contents from a safe distance, mark the location on their maps with a priority flag for investigation by specialized units, and immediately withdraw. This was beyond their expertise, beyond their mission parameters. Whatever had occurred here, whatever was still occurring, required resources and understanding they did not possess. As they prepared to leave, Sergeant Morozov insisted on one final task. He and Private Smirnov returned to the body of the dog that had finally been released from its duty. Working quickly, they dug through the frozen earth with entrenching tools until they had created a shallow grave. They placed the animal's body within and covered it, marking the spot with stones arranged in a cross. It was a small gesture, perhaps meaningless in the scope of industrial warfare, but it felt necessary. This creature had guarded something, sacrificed itself in service to a purpose none of them understood, and deserved at least that recognition. The battalion withdrew at 10:00 hours, moving with unusual haste. As they departed, several men reported looking back at the crater and seeing, for just a moment, shapes moving within its depths beneath the glassy surface. Movement that could have been optical illusion, light playing through ice and translucent material, or movement that suggested the bodies embedded there were not as permanently fixed as they appeared. The journal became Captain Volkov's obsession during the 2-day march to their next assignment. Each night, by the light of a small lamp in his tent, he worked to translate the German text with the assistance of a captured dictionary and his own limited knowledge of the language. What emerged from those pages was a narrative that transformed their brief encounter with the crater from a battlefield curiosity into something that challenged his understanding of the war itself. The journal belonged to a Hauptmann, a captain, named Friedrich Weber of the Wehrmacht Engineering Corps. Weber and his unit of 18 men had been assigned to the sector in late November 1942 as part of the German withdrawal from Stalingrad's outer defenses. Their orders, like Volkov's own, had been routine: survey the territory, document infrastructure, prepare demolitions to deny resources to advancing Soviet forces. They had discovered the crater on December 8. Weber's entries from those first days were clinical, professional. He noted the anomalous depth, the strange vitreous coating, the embedded remains. He hypothesized various causes, each more unlikely than the last. A meteoric impact was ruled out due to lack of corresponding celestial observations. A new Soviet weapon was considered but dismissed because the crater predated Soviet occupation of the sector. Chemical or incendiary munitions could not explain the glass-like fusion. Then, on December 12, the entries changed. Weber described finding the object at the crater's center. He had descended alone, against the advice of his men, driven by what he called an obligation to understand. His description matched what Morozov had found: the angular structure, the unknown inscriptions, the sense of wrongness that pervaded its form. But Weber had spent hours studying it, sketching it, attempting to document its properties in detail. He noted that the object seemed to generate localized temperature variations, creating pockets of warmth in the crater, despite the winter conditions. He observed that compasses became unreliable within 10 meters of the structure, needles spinning slowly or pointing toward the object, rather than magnetic north. Most disturbing, he recorded that prolonged observation of the inscriptions produced severe headaches and a sensation he described as thoughts that are not my own, pressing against the inside of my skull like hands against a window. On December 15, Weber reported the first dead dog. His unit had brought 3 German shepherds with them, trained military animals used for patrol and message carrying. One of the dogs, named Odin, had wandered to the crater's edge during the night and was found at dawn sitting upright, unresponsive to commands. Weber's medic examined the animal and found nothing physically wrong, yet the dog refused to move, refused to eat, and showed no reaction to stimuli beyond maintaining its watch over the crater. Weber ordered the dog removed by force. 4 men were required to drag the animal away, and even then, it fought with such desperate, singular intensity that they feared it would injure itself. Once placed in a vehicle and driven several kilometers from the site, the dog became docile again, though it never fully recovered. It died 3 days later of what the medic attributed to shock and exhaustion, though Weber noted in his journal that he suspected something else, something he could not articulate. The second dog, Brynhilder, took Odin's place at the crater's edge the following day. The third, Wotan, followed within a week. Weber described his growing horror as he realized the animals were being drawn to the site. Compelled by something to maintain a vigil, they could not abandon even at the cost of their lives. He wrote extensively about his attempts to understand the mechanism. Was it a sound beyond human hearing? A scent? Some form of radiation or electromagnetic field? All his tests proved inconclusive. On December 23rd, Weber recorded what he called the expansion. Members of his unit began experiencing symptoms similar to those he had felt when studying the inscriptions: headaches, intrusive thoughts, vivid dreams of places they had never been, and events that had not occurred. Feldwebel, a sergeant, named Klaus Richter, became obsessed with the idea that the crater was older than they had assumed, that it predated not just the war, but human civilization entirely. He spent his off-duty hours at the crater's edge, sketching the positions of the embedded bodies, convinced they formed a pattern, a message. Another soldier, Gefreiter Otto Braun, developed acute paranoia, insisting that the bodies in the crater were not dead, but sleeping, waiting for some signal to wake. He became violent when others dismissed his claims, and Weber was forced to have him restrained and evacuated to a field hospital. Braun's final words to Weber, recorded in the journal, were chilling. "They are already waking up. The dogs know it. That is why they watch. That is why they will never leave." Weber's last entries, dated January 4th through January 7th, documented his decision to abandon the site. His unit had been reduced to 11 men, the rest lost to illness, accidents, or psychological breakdown. The German High Command had issued new withdrawal orders, and Weber seized the opportunity to leave the crater behind. But his final entry, written on the morning of January 7th, revealed something that explained why the journal had been left at the crater, rather than taken with its author. Weber had returned to the crater one last time, alone, to confirm something he had begun to suspect. He descended into its depths with a shovel, intending to excavate near the central object, to determine if it extended deeper into the earth or was merely sitting on the surface. After an hour of careful digging through the glassy material, which he noted was surprisingly soft, almost organic, he reached a depth of approximately 2 meters below the crater floor. What he found there destroyed whatever remained of his rational worldview. The object did not end. It extended downward indefinitely, or at least as far as his excavation could reveal. But more than that, the material surrounding it changed. The glassy substance gave way to something else, something that resembled stone, but moved slightly when touched, contracting as if alive. And within that living stone, Weber saw more bodies. Not soldiers, not recent casualties of war, but remains that looked ancient, mummified, dressed in clothing and armor from eras he could not immediately place. He saw what appeared to be Roman legionnaires based on their segmented armor. He saw figures in medieval chainmail. He saw others in uniforms that might have been from the Napoleonic Wars, from the American Civil War, from conflicts spanning centuries. All embedded, all preserved, all pressing against the interior surface of whatever this structure was, as if trying to escape or, more horrifying, trying to get in. Weber's final paragraph was barely legible, written in a shaking hand. He stated that he understood now what the crater truly was. It was not the result of a weapon or a meteor or any natural phenomenon. It was an opening, a puncture in the earth that had existed for far longer than modern warfare, perhaps for millennia. Each conflict that passed over this ground added new layers, new victims, new guardians. The dogs were not protecting the crater. They were trying to keep humanity away from what lay beneath, from what was slowly, inevitably, pushing its way up. He concluded with a directive to whoever found his journal. The site must be destroyed completely, burned with thermite or white phosphorus, or buried under tons of concrete. Under no circumstances should anyone attempt to remove or study the central object, and under absolutely no circumstances should anyone remain at the site after dark, because that was when the sounds began, when the thing beneath became most active, when the temptation to descend and join the others became almost impossible to resist. The journal ended there. No signature, no formal conclusion, just a final sentence that Captain Volkov read and reread a dozen times, trying to find some alternate interpretation. I am going down one last time. I need to see them wake up. I need to understand what they have been trying to tell me. Volkov shared his translation with his senior officers. The reaction was mixed. Some dismissed Weber's account as the ravings of a man driven mad by stress and the harsh conditions of the Eastern Front. Others, including Sergeant Morozov, who had descended into the crater and seen the object firsthand, found the journal's descriptions uncomfortably accurate. Lieutenant Petrov pointed out that Weber's observations about the dogs matched their own experience precisely, which suggested at least some elements of his account were reliable. The debate became moot when new orders arrived on February 21st. The battalion was being reassigned immediately to frontline operations near Kharkov. All survey materials, including documentation of anomalous findings, were to be forwarded to NKVD intelligence for evaluation. The crater's location would be marked on military maps as a potential ordnance hazard and placed off limits pending specialized investigation. Captain Volkov compiled his official report, including Weber's journal and his own unit's observations. He noted the unusual nature of the site, the dead animals, the journal's warnings, and recommended immediate containment and study by qualified scientific personnel. He sent the report through proper channels and assumed that would be the end of his involvement. He was wrong. On March 4, 1943, while his unit was engaged in operations outside Kharkov, Volkov received an encrypted message ordering him to report immediately to a NKVD facility in a location that was not specified until he was already in transit. He was given no explanation, no context, just orders that superseded his normal chain of command. He arrived at the facility, a converted monastery 40 kilometers north of Moscow, on March 7th. There, he was introduced to Colonel Grigory Vasilyev of NKVD Special Investigations and Dr. Ekaterina Novikova, a physicist who had been working on classified projects related to what she would only describe as anomalous phenomena. They wanted to debrief him personally about the crater, to compare his account with Weber's journal, and to assess whether he or any of his men had experienced lasting effects from their exposure to the site. The debriefing lasted 3 days. Volkov described everything he had witnessed, answered hundreds of questions, and submitted to physical and psychological examinations. On the 3rd day, Colonel Vasilyev revealed why Volkov's report had triggered such intense interest. The crater was not unique. Similar sites had been documented across Eastern Europe, North Africa, and Asia. 16 confirmed locations, dozens more suspected. All shared certain characteristics: anomalous depth, vitrified interiors, embedded remains spanning multiple historical periods, and the presence of what Vasilyev called sentinel animals, usually dogs but occasionally wolves, bears, or other species that maintained vigils until death. The objects at the center of these sites varied in size and form, but all shared the angular, impossible geometry and the inscriptions that defied translation. Soviet scientists had been studying 3 such sites since 1939, but their research had been interrupted by the German invasion. Now, with the tide of war turning, there was renewed interest in understanding these phenomena, both for their potential strategic value and for the threat they might represent. Dr. Novikova explained her working theory. She believed the objects were not weapons, not in any conventional sense, but something closer to markers or anchors. She suggested they existed at points where, for reasons not yet understood, the boundary between our physical reality and something else became thin, permeable. The vitrification, the embedded bodies, the psychological effects were all symptoms of that permeability, evidence of contact between our world and whatever lay on the other side. The dogs, she theorized, were sensitive to this boundary in ways humans were not. They could perceive or sense the danger, the wrongness, and their instinct was to guard against it, to prevent others from approaching. It was possible, she suggested, that this behavior was not learned but inherited, passed down through countless generations of canine evolution as a survival mechanism against something far older than human civilization. Volkov asked the obvious question: if these sites were so dangerous, why not simply destroy them? Colonel Vasilyev's answer was blunt. They had tried. In 1941, before the German invasion, Soviet military engineers had attempted to demolish one of the sites using conventional explosives. The result had been catastrophic. The explosion had created not closure, but expansion. The crater had deepened, widened, and the vitrified area had spread outward by several hundred meters, consuming a village and its 300 residents in the process. The entire zone had become unstable, reality itself seeming to fracture. Teams sent to investigate reported impossible spatial distortions, objects appearing in multiple locations simultaneously, and time dilation effects where hours passed differently for those inside the affected area compared to observers outside. The site had been abandoned, surrounded by a cordon, and officially attributed to a German chemical weapon attack. It remained closed to this day, monitored by remote observation only. Any attempt to enter the zone resulted in the observer becoming disoriented and, if they persisted, disappearing entirely. 4 scientists, 7 soldiers, and 2 NKVD officers had vanished into that failed containment zone. None had returned. Given this history, the current strategy was observation and documentation, not intervention. Volkov's crater, along with the 15 others, would be monitored from a distance. Animals that attempted to establish vigils would be observed but not prevented. Research would continue, but all direct interaction with the central objects had been suspended indefinitely. Volkov returned to his unit on March 12th, sworn to secrecy about everything he had learned. He found that his men had been similarly debriefed, though none had been taken to Moscow. They were under orders not to discuss the crater with anyone outside their immediate unit. The official story was that they had encountered a contaminated chemical weapons test site and had handled the situation appropriately by withdrawing and reporting it. For Volkov, the war continued for 2 more years. He fought at Kursk, at Kiev, and eventually pushed westward into Poland and Germany with the advancing Red Army. He survived where millions did not, and when the war ended in May 1945, he returned to civilian life with medals, commendations, and nightmares that never entirely faded. But he never forgot the crater or the dog that had guarded it. In the decades that followed, he occasionally attempted to learn more about the site, to discover whether the NKVD's research had yielded any conclusions. He found nothing. Records were classified or destroyed. Dr. Novikova had died in 1948 under circumstances that were never publicly explained. Colonel Vasilyev had disappeared during Stalin's purges in 1953. The crater itself, according to what little information Volkov could gather, remained off-limits through the Soviet era and into the Russian Federation period. Maps showed it as contaminated ground, unsafe for human habitation. Satellite imagery, which became available in later years, showed the site surrounded by forest, the crater itself barely visible beneath dense vegetation. But if one looked carefully at those images, enhanced and magnified, it was possible to see shapes around the crater's perimeter. Small shapes, spaced at intervals, sitting upright. Volkov died in 2006, at the age of 87. Among his personal effects, his family found a journal he had kept separate from his official war memoirs. In it, he had documented everything about the crater, transcribed Weber's journal in full, and added his own observations from 5 decades of trying to understand what he had witnessed. His final entry, written just 3 days before his death, contained a troubling revelation. He had been contacted by a former member of his battalion, Private Yuri Smirnov, now an elderly man living in Ukraine. Smirnov reported that he had been experiencing recurring dreams about the crater, dreams that had grown more vivid and specific over the years. In these dreams, he stood at the crater's edge and watched as the glassy surface cracked, as the bodies embedded within began to move, as the central object pulsed with that pale luminescence, and something vast and patient finally pushed its way through from wherever it had been waiting. Smirnov claimed he was not the only one. He had located 3 other survivors from their battalion, and all reported similar dreams. More troubling, Smirnov had traveled to the crater's location in 2005. Defying the contamination warnings, he found the site much as they had left it 62 years earlier. The crater remained, the vitrification remained, and the dogs remained. Or rather, new dogs had taken the places of those who had fallen. 7 animals sat at the crater's edge, thin and dying, maintaining their vigil just as their predecessors had. Smirnov approached one of the dogs, hoping to offer it food and water, to show the kindness he had been unable to provide to the guardian they had found in 1943. The animal watched his approach with those same empty mechanical eyes, and as Smirnov drew close enough to touch it, the dog spoke. Not barked, not whined, but spoke in a voice that Smirnov described as being like dozens of voices overlapping, human and animal and something else entirely, all struggling to form words through a throat not designed for speech. It said 3 words in Russian. "They are waking." Then the dog returned to its silent vigil, and Smirnov ran. He ran until his 78-year-old legs could carry him no further, until he collapsed in a field kilometers from the crater, weeping with a fear he could not articulate. He never returned. He never spoke of it to anyone except Volkov, and even then, only in that final phone call, only in the desperate hope that Volkov would tell him he had imagined it, that the trauma of war and old age had created a false memory. Volkov could not provide that reassurance. He told Smirnov about the NKVD debriefing, about Dr. Novikova's theories, about the other sites scattered across the world. He told him that whatever they had found in that crater was not finished, that it was part of something larger and older and more patient than human civilization could comprehend. And he told him what Colonel Vasilyev had said in their final conversation, words that Volkov had tried for 60 years to dismiss as paranoia, but could no longer ignore. Vasilyev had claimed that analysis of the inscriptions on the central objects, using methods he would not specify, had yielded a partial translation. Only 3 symbols had been successfully interpreted, but those 3 were enough to fundamentally alter their understanding of what the sites represented. The symbols, according to Vasilyev, translated approximately to when, enough, and remember, not instructions or warnings, but markers in time. Indicators that something was counting, waiting for a threshold to be reached, for enough blood to be spilled, enough death to accumulate, enough trauma to soak into the earth. And when that threshold was met, those who had been embedded, those who had been waiting in that space between life and death, would remember what they had been before they became trapped. They would remember, and they would wake, and they would emerge. Captain Dmitry Volkov's final journal entry ended with a question. How many more wars will it take? How many more dogs will die trying to warn us? And when they finally wake, when the threshold is reached, will we even recognize what we have become by then? Or will we simply join them in the glass, pressed against the barrier, waiting for the next cycle to begin? The journal was found by his daughter, who read it with growing horror and confusion. She considered it the product of dementia, the sad deterioration of a once sharp mind. She placed it in a box with his other effects and stored it in her attic, intending to eventually donate his war materials to a military museum. But sometimes, late at night, she thinks about her father's final days, how he would wake gasping from nightmares he refused to describe, how he kept a photograph on his bedside table showing a dog's grave marked with stones, a photo she had never seen before his death, how he would sometimes stare at maps of Eastern Europe for hours, marking locations with a red pen, connecting them with lines that formed patterns she could not decipher. And she thinks about the news reports that occasionally surface from remote areas of Russia, Ukraine, Poland, and other former Soviet territories. Reports of contaminated zones, of areas where animals behave strangely, where compasses fail, and where people who venture too close return changed, if they return at all. Reports that are quickly suppressed, attributed to residual Cold War paranoia, or environmental contamination from industrial accidents. She wonders if her father was right. She wonders if, somewhere beneath the snow and soil of places where humanity has spilled its blood for millennia, something is counting, waiting, remembering. She wonders if the dogs that still sit silent vigil at the edges of forgotten craters know something we have collectively chosen to ignore. And late at night, when sleep will not come, she finds herself praying. Not the formal prayers of Orthodox tradition, but something more desperate and personal. She prays to God and to Jesus Christ, asking for protection, for wisdom, for the strength to face whatever truth her father discovered in that crater so long ago. She prays that the threshold, whatever it is, will never be reached, that the dogs will continue their watch forever, that the things embedded in glass will remain frozen, trapped between worlds, unable to complete whatever purpose drives them. She prays, and in the darkness of her room, She could swear she hears something in the distance. Not words, not exactly. More like the memory of words, the shape of meaning without sound. And those word shapes feel ancient and patient, and utterly without mercy. They feel like counting, like the slow accumulation of years and deaths and forgotten horrors. They feel like something enormous taking a breath before speaking. They feel like waking up. Remember to seek shelter in faith. Remember that even in the darkest moments of history, when humanity faces horrors beyond comprehension, there remains the light of Christ, the promise of salvation, and the strength found in the love of God. Whatever darkness exists in this world, whatever ancient evils wait beneath the surface of our understanding, they are not beyond the reach of divine grace. Turn to Jesus, embrace his teachings, and know that no matter how deep the crater, no matter how patient the evil, faith provides a refuge that cannot be breached. Pray for protection, pray for wisdom, and pray for those who stand watch in the darkness, both animal and human, guarding against things we cannot see. For it is only through God's love that we find true safety from the horrors that wait, counting beneath the world we think we know.